The old man in the wheelchair had nobody, and the woman standing beside him at the defense table had no reason in the world to be there, except that she had said she would be, and she was a person who kept her word. His name was Earl Dixon, 71 years old, and the county was about to take the only thing he had left. The room was the small courtroom on the third floor of the Hennepin Civil Building, the one with the buzzing light over the clerk's desk and the radiator that knocked all winter. Earl sat in his chair with his hands folded in his lap, and his hands were shaking, and he was trying to hide it by pressing them down against his knees. Across the aisle sat two lawyers from a property management company in suits that cost more than Earl's monthly disability check, and they had brought a stack of paper a foot high, and they had brought the kind of patience that comes from never having lost. And next to Earl in a blazer, she had bought at a thrift store for $9 and pressed that morning with an iron that only worked if you held the button down, stood Renee Carter, 34 years old. A single mother of two, she was not a lawyer, not the way the men across the aisle were lawyers. She had a license she had earned at night while her kids slept, a license she had used exactly 4 times in 3 years, every one of those times for free, because the people who needed her could not pay, and the people who could pay already had someone better. She had no idea, standing there with her hand resting on the back of Earl's wheelchair, that a man in the back row of that courtroom was watching her, and that the watching would change her life. Stay with me, because what happened in that room was the smallest thing, and it turned out to be the largest. Renee had met Earl Dixon 6 weeks earlier at the laundromat on Lake Street, where she did her wash on Sunday mornings, because the machines were cheaper before noon. He had been sitting by the folding table with an envelope in his lap and a look on his face like a man reading his own bad news, and she had asked him if he was all right, the way her mother had taught her to ask people, meaning it. He had not been all right. The letter in the envelope said that the rooming house where he had lived for 19 years had been bought by a company she had never heard of, and that the company had filed to evict him on the grounds that his lease, the one he had signed in a manager's office in 2006, the one that was supposed to last as long as he could pay, was not valid, had never been valid, and that he owed back rent under a new schedule he had never agreed to. $4,200. He had $1,100 in a credit union account and a Social Security check that came on the 3rd of the month and went out again by the 10th. She had read the letter twice, standing there in the smell of dryer sheets and bleach, and then she had sat down across from him and said the thing that started all of it. She said, "I think they are counting on you not knowing your rights, and I know a few of them." Earl had looked at her like she was speaking a language he had given up on hearing. He asked her what it would cost. She told him nothing. He did not believe her, because nobody had done anything for nothing in a long time, and she did not argue with him, because arguing with a tired man about kindness only tires him more. She just took down his address on the back of a receipt and told him she would come by. What Renee did not say, what she never said to anyone, was that she knew exactly what it felt like to hold a letter like his. 3 years before, she had held one of her own. An eviction, a landlord who knew the rules better than she did, a court date she walked into alone and walked out of having lost, with 2 children and 4 trash bags and a car that smelled like cold French fries. She had slept in that car with Marcus and little Tasha for 6 nights in the lot behind a closed grocery store, the children in the back under every blanket she owned, Renee in the front seat awake, watching the door of the store and the slow blue of the morning. She had promised herself on the 5th of those nights that if she ever clawed her way back to solid ground, she would learn the rules that had buried her, and she would stand between them and anyone else they came for. She had kept that promise the hard way. Community college, then a paralegal certificate, then the long, strange road of studying for the bar while cleaning offices at night, and she had passed it on the 2nd try, and she had cried in the parking ramp for 20 minutes, and then she had gone to work cleaning offices, because a license does not pay rent, and a name on a roster at a firm requires a firm to put you on it, and no firm had. So she was, on paper, a lawyer. In her life, she was a woman who mopped the floors of a downtown tower from 10 at night until 6 in the morning, 4 nights a week, and who took the bus home in the dark and got her kids to school and slept when she could. The law was the thing she did in the cracks, for free for people like Earl, because the promise she had made in that car was the realest thing she owned. She spent those 6 weeks the way you spend money you do not have. She read Earl's lease until she knew it by heart. The carbon faint type and the smudge where someone had pressed too hard with a pen in 2006. She went to the county recorder on her 1-week day off and stood in line behind people pulling deeds and liens, and she pulled the chain of title on the rooming house and found the sale and found the company, a limited liability thing with a name like a law firm and an address that was a mailbox in a strip mall out past the airport. She paid $4. She could not spare for the certified copy and carried it home flat against her chest so it would not crease in her bag. She found that the eviction filing leaned on a single claim that Earl's 2006 lease had been superseded by a building-wide agreement in 2019, and she found after 3 nights of reading on a library computer, because her phone data ran out on the 14th and the rent of her own apartment did not care, that the 2019 agreement had never been signed by Earl, had never been delivered to Earl, and under the state's own statute could not bind a sitting tenant who had not received written notice. The librarian, a heavy-set man named Dennis, who closed the branch at 9, started leaving the good computer in the corner free for her without being asked. And on the last night, he printed her statute citations on the office laser printer and waved off the dime she tried to give him for the paper. It was not a brilliant argument. It was a small, true one. The whole case came down to a piece of paper that did not exist, and a man who had paid his rent on the 3rd of every month for 19 years. She built her file at the kitchen table after the kids were down, in a notebook with a cover that said, "Be the light," in faded gold. A notebook Tasha had picked out for her at the dollar store. She wrote her argument out longhand, because typing it made it feel like it belonged to someone with an office. Marcus, who was 11, asked her one night why she was helping a man she barely knew when they could barely help themselves, and she set down her pen and thought about how to answer him without lying and without scaring him. She said, "Because once nobody helped us, and I felt what that did, and I decided I would rather be tired than be the kind of person who looks away." Marcus did not say anything that night. The next morning he had packed his own lunch, and his sister's too, without being asked, and Renee saw the lunches on the counter and had to turn to the sink so he would not see her face. There was a man named Walter Reese who would later say that he came to that courthouse by accident, and it was almost true. Walter Reese was 63 years old, and he was worth. On the morning he walked into the Hennepin Civil Building, a little over $3 billion, most of it built from a logistics company he had started with one truck and a route nobody else wanted. He did not look like $3 billion. He looked like a retired schoolteacher in a grey coat, which was how he preferred it. He had come downtown that day for a deposition in a matter that did not concern him much, a fight between 2 of his own subsidiaries that the lawyers should have settled and had not, and the deposition had ended early, and he had been walking to the elevator when he heard through the open door of a small courtroom a voice he could not place and could not walk away from. It was a woman's voice, low and steady, and it was saying, "Your Honor, my client is not asking for charity. He is asking for the contract he signed to mean what it says." Walter stopped in the hallway. He was a man who had spent 40 years listening to lawyers, the best that money could rent, men and women who could make a wrong thing sound inevitable. He had learned to hear the difference between someone performing certainty and someone who simply had it. The voice through the door had it. He stepped inside and sat in the back row in his grey coat, and no one looked at him twice, because no one ever did, which was the only luxury he had refused to give up. What he saw was a woman in a thrift store blazer standing next to an old man in a wheelchair with a dollar store notebook open on the table in front of her, facing 2 lawyers and a stack of paper and a judge who looked tired in the particular way of judges who have watched the well-funded win all morning. And he watched the woman take that case apart, not with theatrics, not with a single raised voice, but with the patient, unhurried laying down of one true fact after another, until the foot-high stack of paper across the aisle looked like exactly what it was, which was a great deal of noise built around a document that had never been signed. He watched the company's lead lawyer object and watched the woman wait him out. He watched her hand the clerk, a copy of the recorder's chain of title with a hand that did not shake, though he would learn later how much it cost her to keep it from shaking. And he watched her say, when the judge asked her plainly whether her client had ever received the 2019 agreement, the simplest sentence in the whole proceeding. She said, "No, Your Honor, he never did. And I can show you why that matters." Walter had been in 100 rooms where money decided the outcome before anyone sat down. He had, if he was honest with himself in the quiet of that back row, paid for that outcome more than once. What he was watching now was the other thing, the thing he had stopped believing the system still produced. He was watching a person stand in the gap for someone who could do nothing for her in return, and do it well, and do it for free. He did not move for the next 40 minutes. Around the midpoint of that hour, while the company's lawyers huddled and whispered, and the judge called a brief recess, Walter found himself thinking about his own mother, who had cleaned rooms in a hotel in Gary, Indiana, and who had once been put out of an apartment by a man with better paper, and who had died before her son had a single dollar to his name. He had spent his life building something that could not be taken. He had never once used it to stand where this woman was standing. The thought sat in him like a stone. Have you ever watched someone do, for nothing, the exact thing you built an empire to never have to need? He had not, until that morning. He would not forget it. When the recess ended, the company's lead lawyer tried the last move that people with paper try when the paper fails them. He stood and suggested in the smooth voice of a man offering a gift that his client was prepared to be generous, that they would waive the disputed back rent and allow Mr. Pryor, Dixon, to sign a new month-to-month agreement effective immediately, which any reasonable person would call a fair resolution. He looked at Renee when he said, "reasonable," and the look had a blade in it because a month-to-month agreement meant they could put Earl out in 30 days for no reason at all, the moment the courtroom emptied and no one was watching. Renee did not raise her voice. She did not need to. She said that her client appreciated the company's sudden generosity and that she was sure the company appreciated that Mr. Dixon's existing lease remained in force, valid and binding, and that her client would be happy to keep paying his rent on the 3rd of every month, as he had for 19 years into the account the company had so recently acquired. She said she had brought 19 years of money orders to prove the pattern, and she set a rubber-banded brick of yellow carbon copies on the table, and the small dry sound it made was louder than anything the lawyers had said all morning. The judge ruled from the bench. The 2019 agreement, never delivered and never signed, did not bind Earl. The original lease stood. The eviction was dismissed. The company would bear the filing costs. It took 90 seconds, and it undid 6 weeks of a frightened man's sleepless nights, and Earl put his shaking hand over his mouth and made a sound that was not quite crying and not quite laughing, and Renee crouched down beside his wheelchair so they were eye to eye and said, "Dixon, you get to stay home." The two lawyers packed their foot of paper into rolling cases and left without looking at her. The judge thanked her for a well-prepared argument, which judges almost never do, and Renee gathered her dollar store notebook and her brick of money orders and helped Earl turn his chair toward the door, and she did not notice the man in the grey coat in the back row, who had stood when she stood and who was waiting. He caught up to her in the marble lobby downstairs, where the light came in cold through the tall windows and her footsteps echoed because the place was built to make ordinary people feel small. He said, "Excuse me," and she turned, half expecting him to be someone from the company, come to start a new kind of trouble. He was not. He was just an older man in a plain grey coat with kind, tired eyes and a way of standing that was very still. He said, "I watched what you did up there. I have watched lawyers. My whole life. I have never watched anything like that." Renee thanked him, the way you thank a stranger who is being nice, already turning back toward Earl. The man asked her where she practiced. She told him the truth because she had never learned the trick of making her life sound like more than it was. She said she did not practice anywhere. She said she had a license and a night job mopping floors, and she took cases like Earl's when she could for people who could not pay, and that was all. She said it without apology and without shame, and that, more than anything, was what undid Walter, because he had met 10,000 people who told him what they wanted, and almost none who simply told him the truth. He asked if he could buy her a cup of coffee. She said she had to get Mr. Dixon home and pick up her kids, and she could not. And she was sorry. And she meant the sorry, but she had a life to get back to. And the man was a stranger, and strangers who buy coffee usually want something. She wheeled Earl out into the grey afternoon and put him in the accessible van the courthouse had called, and she stood on the curb and watched the van pull away and saw him lift one shaking hand to the window, and she lifted hers back. Then she rode the bus home, the number 21 that ran down Lake Street past the laundromat where she had met him, and she sat in the back with her dollar store notebook on her knees and her brick of money orders in her bag, and she let herself, for the length of 2 stops, simply be a person who had won. A teenager across the aisle had his music up too loud, and an old woman near the front was talking to herself about her sister, and the ordinary noise of it felt, that afternoon, like something close to music. She did not think about the man in the grey coat again that day, because that day she had won. And she wanted to hold the winning a little longer before the world took it back the way it usually did. She picked Tasha up from the neighbours and made grilled cheese for dinner and cut the sandwiches into triangles the way Tasha liked. And when Marcus asked her how the case went, she said only that the old man got to keep his home, and Marcus nodded like that was simply how things were supposed to go, and she did not correct him, because she wanted him to grow up believing it could be. What she did not know was that the man in the grey coat had stood in that lobby and watched her go, and had then walked back upstairs to the clerk's office and asked politely for the name of the attorney who had appeared for the defense in the Dixon matter. The clerk told him, Renee Carter. He wrote it down in a small notebook of his own, and under it he wrote one word, the word he had been turning over since the recess. The word was finally. Walter did not build the $3 billion company by acting on feelings. He built it by checking. So he did not call Renee the next morning, though he wanted to. Instead, he gave her name to a woman named Camille Ford, who ran the part of his life that touched the law, and he told Camille to find out who Renee was. Not to investigate her, to understand her. There is a difference, and Camille, who had worked for Walter for 20 years, knew it. What Camille found over the following week was a record so plain it read like a rebuke. A woman who had passed the bar on her second attempt at 31. No firm, no disciplinary history, because there had been almost no practice to discipline. 4 appearances in 3 years, every one pro bono, every one for a tenant or a worker or an old person with no money and a problem the law could have solved, if anyone had bothered. A child support case for a woman whose ex had vanished. A wage claim for 3 line, cooks a restaurant had stiffed. A guardianship for a man whose family was trying to take his small house. And now Earl. Camille pulled the transcripts where they existed, and she read them on a Thursday night. And on Friday morning she walked into Walter's office and set them on his desk and said, I have been doing this a long time. She is the real thing. I do not say that. Walter asked Camille what she would do if she were him. Camille said, I would offer her a job, and I would expect her to say no, and I would respect her more when she did. There was a thing Camille had found that she had not put in the file, because it was not the law and it was not her business, except that it was the kind of thing that told you everything. 3 years back, in the same court system, there was a Renee on the other side of an eviction. The losing side, the tenant. Camille had stood in her own kitchen with that printout in her hand and understood that the woman in the thrift store blazer had not learned the law in the abstract. She had learned it the way you learn the shape of a thing that has hit you. She had been the old man in the wheelchair once, and instead of becoming hard, she had gone back and learned how to stand where no one had stood for her. Renee, meanwhile, had gone back to her life because winning a case does not change the fact that the rent is due. She mopped the floors of the downtown tower on Monday and Tuesday nights. She made Tasha's lunch and checked Marcus's math and sat at the kitchen table at midnight with the dollar store notebook because a woman named Gloria from her building had heard about Earl and had a problem of her own, a debt collector calling about a hospital bill that was not even hers, and Renee was already reading the statute on that. already pulling the thread because that was simply who she was, and she could no more leave Gloria to face it alone than she could leave her own children at the bus stop in the rain. So when her phone rang on a Wednesday afternoon with a number she did not know, she almost did not answer, because numbers she did not know were usually collectors or scams. She answered on the last ring because Tasha had a cold and the school might be calling. It was not the school. It was a woman with a calm, warm voice who said her name was Camille Ford and that she was calling on behalf of someone who had been in the courtroom the day of the Dixon hearing, and that this someone would very much like to meet with her at a time and place of Renee's choosing about a professional opportunity. Renee stood in her kitchen with a dish towel over her shoulder and her sick daughter on the couch, and said with the flat caution of a woman who had learned that opportunity was usually a trap with a nicer name, "What kind of opportunity?" Camille did not oversell it. That was deliberate. She said, an honest one. She said the man she worked for ran a company and that the company had more money than it had decency, in his own words, and that he wanted to build something to fix the second part and that he believed Renee was the person to build it. She said there was no catch she could see and she had spent 20 years looking for catches. She said, "Come and hear it. And if it smells wrong, you walk out and we will have wasted an hour of your afternoon and nothing else." Renee went because Camille had not pushed, and the not pushing was the only thing that had ever made Renee trust anyone. She arranged for her neighbor to sit with the kids. She wore the same $9 blazer, pressed again. She took the bus downtown to an address that turned out to be the same gleaming tower, whose floors she mopped 4 nights a week, and she stood in the lobby she had cleaned, in the marble she knew the smell of, and she rode the elevator up past the floors she had only ever seen empty and dark, to a floor she had never been allowed onto. And the woman with the warm voice met her at the doors and walked her to a corner office with a view of the whole grey city. And the man behind the desk stood up, and it was the man in the grey coat. He was not wearing the coat now. He was wearing a sweater and the same tired kind eyes, and he came around the desk and shook her hand and said, "Ms. Carter, my name is Walter, and I owe you an apology, because I had my colleague look into you before I let myself believe what I saw, and a person like you deserves to be taken at her word the first time." Renee did not sit down right away. She looked at the office and the view and the man, and she did the arithmetic she had done her whole life. The arithmetic of what does this cost and who pays. She said, "I clean this building, I mop the floor you are standing on. Wednesdays and Sundays I am 2 floors down with a cart." She said it to see what his face would do. She had learned to read what a man's face did when he found out what you were. Walter's face did not do the thing she expected. It did not flinch, and it did not perform sympathy. It got very still, and then he said, "My mother cleaned rooms in a hotel for 31 years, and a man with better paper than she had put her out of her home when I was 9, and I have spent my whole life making sure that could never happen to me again, and not one day of it making sure it could never happen to anyone else." He said, "I watched you do for a stranger, for free, the thing I built all of this to avoid ever needing, and I have been ashamed of myself for a week." Then he told her what he wanted to build. Not a charity, he said, because charity closes when the money gets tight and the people who need it learn not to count on it. A real thing. A legal office inside his company, funded out of his own pocket and walled off from it, that did nothing but what she had done for Earl. Tenants, workers, old people. Anyone with a true case and no money to fight it. He wanted her to run it. He wanted her to hire the lawyers, set the rules, take the cases, and answer to no one but the people she helped. He named a salary, and Renee had to ask him to say it again, because the first time she was sure she had misheard, and the number was more than she had made in the last 4 years put together. She was quiet for a long moment. Then she asked the question that mattered more to her than the money, the question that came straight out of 6 nights in a car behind a grocery store. She asked when it gets expensive, and it will, and the cases get hard, and they will, and somebody on your board decides this office is a luxury you cannot afford, who decides whether it stays? Walter looked at her, and he understood that she had already lost everything once to a person who could close a door on her, and that she would not put herself or anyone she helped behind another door that someone else could close. He said, "I have thought about that." He slid a folder across the desk. It was the endowment. He had already done it before she walked in, on the chance that she would ask the exact question she asked. The office was funded for 20 years no matter what the company did, no matter what his board said, no matter whether Walter himself was alive. It could not be closed by anyone but her. He had built the one thing she needed before she knew to need it, which was a door that locked from the inside. Renee read the folder twice, the way she read everything twice, in the smell of fresh coffee instead of dryer sheets. And then the woman who had not cried in front of a stranger since the parking ramp the night she passed the bar put her hand over her mouth, and she let herself, for just a moment, in a corner office she had been mopping the floor beneath the night before, be a person to whom a good thing had finally happened. She said yes. She said it her way, though, which was to say she had conditions, and she counted them out on her fingers like a woman who had learned not to leave anything to a handshake. The first was that Earl got a parking space and a standing invitation, because he was the reason any of this existed, and she would not have him forgotten the moment he stopped being useful. The second was that her first hire would be a woman named Gloria, who was not a lawyer, but who knew the buildings and the people, and would find the cases the lawyers would never hear about, the ones that never make it as far as a courthouse, because the person with the problem assumes there is no point. The third condition was the one she cared about most, and she said it slowly so there would be no mistaking it. The office would not be named after Walter, and it would not be named after her. It would be named after the thing it was for, and they would settle on that name together. And whatever it turned out to be, it would not sit on a letterhead in a font that made an old man with a letter in his lap feel small before he had even said hello. The man behind the desk listened to all three conditions without interrupting. She noticed, because most people with money treated listening as a thing they did while waiting for their turn to talk. When she finished, he did not negotiate. He said, "Those are not conditions. Those are the whole point." And he wrote each one down in his own small notebook in his own hand, and she watched him do it, and something in her that had been braced for years let go by one notch. Walter agreed to all of it. Camille, watching from the doorway, wrote nothing down, because some things you do not need to write down to remember. Renee did not quit the cleaning job by phone the way the office would have arranged for her. She finished out her 2 weeks mopping the floors of the tower from 10 at night until 6 in the morning, because the people she worked beside on that shift were her people, and you do not vanish on your people because your luck turned. She told them on a break in the basement room where the carts were charged, over vending machine coffee and paper cups, and the woman named Pat, who had trained her on the floor buffer 3 years back, hugged her so hard she spilled the coffee down both their sleeves and laughed and cried and made Renee promise to remember them when she was important. And Renee said she would never be important enough to forget the people who had taught her to keep going. On her last night, she pushed her cart past the dark corner office on the high floor that was now going to be hers, and she stood in the doorway in her work clothes with the city spread out below in cold points of light, the mop water cooling in the bucket behind her, and the floor buffer humming somewhere down the hall. And she thought about the woman in the front seat of a Honda behind a closed grocery store, awake, watching the door, promising the dark that if she ever got out, she would learn the rules and stand in the gap. She had not known, that night, that the promise would be kept in a building she would one day own a piece of. She had only known she meant it. The office opened the following spring. Renee hired 3 lawyers who had the license and the hunger, and not one connection between them, the kind of lawyers no firm calls back, and she put Gloria at the front desk where Gloria knew everyone's name before they finished signing in. In the first year, they took 240 cases, and they did not lose the way the old companies counted losing, because even the ones they could not win in front of a judge, they refused to let anyone go through alone. There was a woman named Denise who came in the second month, 3 children and a notice from the gas company and a landlord who had stopped fixing the furnace in November, and Renee took the case herself and stood in the same third-floor courtroom and made the same patient, unhurried argument. And Denise went home with her heat restored, and $190 in withheld rent she had been afraid to keep. And there was a line cook named Reggie whose paychecks had bounced 4 times, and a grandmother named Joy whose grandson's school had pushed him out without the hearing the law required, and each of them sat in the waiting room first, frightened, certain there was a catch, the way every poor person who has been burned learns to expect one. Earl came on Tuesdays and sat in the waiting room in his chair and told the frightened people who came in that the lady would help them, that he had been where they were sitting, that he still lived in the same room he had lived in for 19 years, and that she was the reason. He became, without anyone deciding it, the thing every frightened person in that room needed first, which was proof. Walter came by once a month, in his grey coat, and sat in the back of the waiting room where no one knew him, the way he liked it, and watched the work go on. He never gave a speech. He told Renee once that the office had returned more to him than the company ever had, and when she asked him to explain it, he said only that his mother would have known this place, would have walked in with her own letter in her lap and walked out, standing up, and that he had spent his life too late to give it to her and was giving it to everyone else's mother instead. He did not say it as a sad thing, he said it as a settled one. Renee moved her children that summer into a small house with a yard, the first home she had ever owned, with a kitchen table that did not have to fold away, where the dollar store notebook that said "Be the Light" sat on the counter, full now with 3 more, just like it stacked beside it. Marcus learned to mow the small lawn and complained about it, the way a boy complains about a thing he is secretly proud to be trusted with. Tasha planted marigolds along the front walk because the dollar store had a rack of seed packets by the register and she had picked them out herself. On a Sunday evening near the end of that first summer, Renee sat on her own front step with a cup of coffee going cold in her hands and watched her daughter water the marigolds with a plastic cup. And she thought about how a thing that small had started it, a woman at a folding table asking a stranger if he was all right and meaning it. She had not asked for anything in return. She had only kept the promise she made in the dark. And the world, which does not always but does sometimes, had kept a ledger she did not know was open, and had paid her back in the one currency she had never let herself hope for, which was the chance to stand in the gap for everyone who came after, with a door behind her that locked from the inside and no one left in the cold who walked through it. Tasha turned around with the empty cup and asked her mother if the flowers would come back next year. Renee said they would. She said, marigolds always come back. If you put them somewhere, they can hold on. And she sat there in the last of the light on the step of a house that was hers, and let that be the truth she carried into the dark, which for once she would spend asleep. If you have ever stood in a room where the people with all the money were sure they had already won, and watched one quiet person refuse to be small, you already know what Renee knew in that courtroom, and I would like to hear about the moment you knew it. And if a story about a kindness that was remembered when it was least expected is the kind of story that holds you through a long night, there is another one, Waiting, about a nurse who gave away the last thing she had, not knowing whose life it would hold up.